My name is Vanessa Stapleton, and I'm with Armor Up West Virginia. Part of what we do is helping first responders in crisis, dealing with drug addiction, alcoholism, trauma of any sort. If they've suffered an injury on the job, we will step in and offer help to them. My role with Armor Up West Virginia is to help the family. A lot of times when there is a first responder injured in the line of duty or a first responder trauma, the focus is on the first responder. So my role is to step in and be there for the family. The family often does not get the support that they need. They're kind of left on their own. So I step in and bring support to that family. The reason that I do what I do is because I've been in that position and there was no help for me or my children. So part of what I do also with Armor Up West Virginia is speak at conferences and share my story in hopes that it will help another family to not go through what our family went through. My story itself starts actually before my marriage, before I was married to a law enforcement officer, to better understand how traumatic it was for us. I'll take you back to the beginning of my story, which began when I was 7 years old. My mother was divorced and remarried. It was at that point that I began to be abused by her husband. And I was abused till about the age of 12, I think, physically, emotionally, sexually. It was very bad. And at one point around the age of 12, I can remember reaching out to my mom to try to get some help. She was a very good mother. She's a very wonderful woman. She decided in order to help me, she was going to go to the one place she trusted the most, which was her church. So she went to the church and revealed what I had revealed to her. And instead of calling law enforcement or for help, they called the man who was abusing me and asked him to come in. So I can remember being 12 years old and sitting in the church waiting for him to show up. And he did, and they went into the office beside where I was sitting, and I could hear them. And they asked him if he was abusing me. And obviously his answer was no. So the pastor and the elders and deacons at that time decided it would be best to not bring attention to the issue. They felt like perhaps I was jealous of my mom's marriage, and they sent me back home to be abused more after that. I became very angry with God. I became very angry with the church. For many years, actually, my relationship with God suffered from that. Once I was older and began to understand that people fail, not God, I was able to heal some of those issues from my childhood. Once I was grown and married, I married a military man who later became law enforcement, so I would feel safe. Ultimately, that backfired, but I think it's very common with women who are abused to seek that safety. I can remember as a law enforcement wife, my greatest fear, and I always ask law enforcement wives at conferences, what's your greatest fear of your husband being on the job? And the answer is unanimously the same. It was the same for me, that he's not going to come home, that you're going to get that phone call or you're going to get that knock on the door, and that's where your mind goes. Anytime he doesn't answer the phone, you fear the worst. Never at any time did I ever think PTSD should be my greatest fear or what would ultimately take my family down. I never thought that. I always worried. He worked night shift, so my greatest concern was, of course, him getting shot. Most spouses, when they lay awake at night and their husband's at work, they're not thinking, oh, I hope he doesn't get hurt and get PTSD. They're thinking, how am I going to tell my children if their daddy doesn't come home? But I think because PTSD is so predominant in law enforcement, we should be preparing these families for PTSD, because ultimately the odds are greater that they're going to deal with PTSD than they're going to deal with a death. And I think that we should be offering more resources to these families. When PTSD does come, you're not prepared for it. The resources are very limited, especially in our area. Obviously, Armor Up, West Virginia. I live in West Virginia, and the resources for PTSD are practically non-existent. So if you're seeking help for it, you're going to have to seek help outside of your area, outside of your state. And I can remember that was one of our biggest struggles. One thing I always say when I'm speaking at conferences, I always get a different answer if I ask the guys or law enforcement officers, even the women, if they feel like they have PTSD. The typical answer is no, or maybe a little. But if you ask that spouse, you will 9 times out of 10 get a completely different answer. As soon as you ask the spouse, they say yes, they have PTSD. They have signs of PTSD, but the first responder doesn't want to acknowledge it, and they often don't even see that they do have it. I know in our family, we certainly did not think PTSD would ever be an issue. My ex-husband had military experience, law enforcement experience. You think being a big tough military family, a big tough law enforcement family, that's not going to happen to you. You read about it, you see it on TV, you see the extreme cases on TV, and you think that'll never be us. Ultimately, it was us. I know, looking at our picture, you can see a happy family. You don't see the demons behind that. You don't see the monsters that we fought every day. When you look at our picture, you don't see a man that ultimately would decide to not only end his own life, but end mine as well. You don't see that. His first day graduating the academy was a really happy day. It was a good day. He was very excited. Looking at his picture, you think, yeah, that guy's got it together, beautiful family, he's happy, he likes his career. But when you look at the picture from the day it all fell apart, you can see a complete contrast, a complete different person. His personality, his looks, everything changed. You can physically see the toll that PTSD took, and you can see the anger in his face on that day, the day that he decided to end it all. So July 3rd, 2013 is where things took a turn for our family. He had gone to work that morning, and it was a beautiful day. It was July. We had the windows open in the house. The kids were playing. Early that morning, he had stopped by the house with one of his coworkers. They were on duty, and they were going to grab some breakfast. So they stopped by the house to see the kids, grab some cash to go eat breakfast with the other law enforcement officers in town, and play with the kids for a minute. When they left, the kids all went out on the porch, and they wanted to see the lights and the siren go up the street. So the kids all stand there and wave goodbye. And as he was walking to the cruiser, Mason, who was 5 at the time, we had 4 children. At that time, they were ages 2, 5, 8, and 11. So they're watching him leave, and Mason yells, "Daddy, wait, Daddy, wait. Just give me one more hug. And so he came back to give Mason one more hug. And I remember thinking, that's the strangest thing. Mason had never done that before. They always watched him leave and wave goodbye. And he went onto his cruiser and he drove away. And the kids and I went in the house, made breakfast, and I got in the shower. As I was showering, I streamed Christian radio through my phone, and it kept being interrupted, like my phone was ringing. But I was in the shower, so I couldn't quite get to it. And I remember thinking, my phone never rings like that. Wonder what's going on. My dad had had heart surgery, so I kind of got panicked for a moment when it didn't stop. And I looked out of the shower at my phone and could see the messages lighting up on my phone. Who was the officer that was shot? Is everything okay? And I thought, people get kind of dramatic, and everyone in a small town has a scanner, and sometimes they hear things wrong. I really at that time didn't panic. But as I finished showering, I started to get a little uneasy, so I grabbed my phone to call him to see what was going on. And I called, and he answered, and immediately I could hear it in his voice, and I knew that something was wrong. And the only thing he said was, "Don't panic." And I panicked, of course. He said, "I've been shot." And so I just remember screaming, and he said, "I'm okay. I'm waiting on the ambulance." And I said, "Okay." At this point, I'd pulled the phone in the shower with me. The phone was getting wet, and I turned the water off and jumped out. I don't even think I finished showering. I could hear the cars pulling in my driveway. There were cars pulling in. And from the bathroom, you can see the driveway. So I look out, and they're police cruisers. I knew what they were coming to tell me. So I threw my dirty clothes back on because that's what was laying there. And my kids went running to the door. And I can remember hearing them take off running, "Daddy's here, Daddy's here, Daddy's here," thinking their daddy had come back. And then I heard Mason say, "That's not Daddy." And I started to get upset, and our 11-year-old, who's very intelligent, comes in and says, "What's going on? Why are the cops here but not Daddy?" And he could see the look on my face. And he said, "Mom, what's wrong? What's wrong?" At that point, I could hear the officers coming up my porch, and I had about 15 to 30 seconds there where I just thought, either I tell my child that his dad's been shot, or they're going to. I decided that he should hear that from his mom, so I sat him down on the side of the tub, and I said, "Your dad's been shot, but he's okay." And he said, "What do you need me to do?" I said, "I need you to get your brothers and your sisters ready. We have to go." So he went out to get them. I came to the door. I must have looked completely panicked because immediately the officers were like, No, he's okay, he's okay." And I said, "Are you sure?" And they said, "Yes, we just came to get you." So I brought them in the house, and the other kids at that time were asking, "What's going on? What's going on?" So I sat them down in the living room, and I said, I need to talk to you guys. And it was me, our 4 kids, and 3 police officers. And we all sat in the living room floor. And I said, "Your daddy's been shot." And Mason, our 5-year-old, just started wailing. And I'm trying to calm him. And I said, "He's okay. I'm going to go to the hospital." And one of the officers that was there said, "I'll stay here with the kids." And I said, "He's going to stay with you until Grandma or Grandpa can get here, but Mommy has to go." And Mason said, "Is he dead?" And I said, "No, he's not dead." And he said, "Is he going to die?" And he had just alligator tears streaming down his face. And I remember thinking, if I tell him he's not going to die and something happens, he's going to resent me. But I didn't want to tell him the truth that I didn't know, but I felt like I should probably tell him the truth at that point. And I said, I don't know. But I do know that he knows God, and no matter what happens, we know where he's at. But Mommy has to go right now, and I promise I'll call you later and tell you what's going on. And so I left with the officers. As I was leaving, their grandmother was pulling in, and I knew that they were okay. So as we pulled into the hospital, I remember thinking, I've seen a lot of officer shootings. I'd been a law enforcement officer wife for a very long period of time at that point. And anytime there's a shooting, there are officers everywhere. When we got to the hospital, there was no one. And I remember thinking, that's really strange. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that wasn't right. So we get out of the car, and there's no ambulance. There's no one. So I look at the other officers, and I could tell they looked as panicked as I did. He said, "Let me go see what's going on." I'm standing outside waiting, and I hear a helicopter coming. And at that point, it hit me how bad it was. And I really started to lose it. So the chaplain comes and he says, he's okay. They just want the best care possible for him. And I knew that's not really the case. As we're standing there, he's trying to comfort me. I really was not being comforted very well at that point. I see the ambulance pull up, and I remember thinking, I have to pull it together. I have to be strong for him. So the doctor comes running out, and they let me on the ambulance. And the doctor's, looking him over, and he says, there's no time to bring him in the hospital. We're going to have to send him straight on the helicopter. His blood pressure was 60/30. He had been shot with a shotgun waist down, and the buckshot had shattered his legs completely. And the doctor said, I don't know that we can save his right leg. He's bleeding out. He said, I'm not going to lie to you. If we get him on the helicopter, I think he's going to live, but I don't know about that leg. So they gave us a minute to say our goodbyes, and I watched them put him on the helicopter and fly away. And that was probably one of the hardest moments of my life. I didn't know what I was going to have to tell my kids later that day. I got back in the car and we drove to the hospital, and I can remember thinking, where is everyone? What I didn't know was the man who shot him had dementia, and he had resorted back to, he thought he was in the war. He was fighting with his neighbors, and when it came over the scanner, the officers that responded, my husband at the time was the first one out of his cruiser, and he just shot him with a shotgun. There was no time for anything. Ultimately, he ended up shooting another officer that day as well, and they were all involved in this huge standoff. When I got to the hospital, they let me go back. As soon as I went in, the nurse said, we've called the surgeon. He's on his way. He's going straight into surgery, and your friend's across the hall. And at that point, I thought maybe our other officers had come down. But when I looked across the hall, I saw another officer, a friend of ours, covered in blood. There was just so much chaos and commotion. He had been shot in the face and the neck with the same shotgun. Fortunately, he had his shotgun up, and his shotgun took most of the blast, but he was in serious trouble as well. And so I was going back and forth between the two of them, trying to relay messages. They were worried about each other. And then they took him back to surgery, my husband at the time, and that was the last I saw him for several hours. I came out, and there was hundreds of officers in the waiting area. Such support for that event. There's always a huge support when something like that happens. It's not until months later that the support is gone and you're left sitting to pick up the pieces. But that day, they were all there. Ultimately, he came out of surgery, and it was kind of hit or miss for a few days on whether or not he was going to be able to keep using that leg. He was in a wheelchair for a while. Physical therapy put him on a walker and then onto crutches. At the point he got on crutches, workers' comp kicked him off. They decided that they weren't going to pay anymore. He still didn't have use of his legs, so the guys would come load him up in what they call the paddy wagon. That's what they transport their prisoners in. And they would take him to the courthouse and prop him up with ice so that he could get a paycheck at least, because workers' comp had kicked him off. And then after quite a bit of physical therapy, he did go back on duty. And I just remember thinking, we made it. We survived. We're the toughest family around. We've got this. I had no idea that a year and a half later, PTSD would creep in and ultimately take him down. I can remember we went to a movie. He was military. He loved military movies. And I had been seeing some signs and symptoms and thought maybe PTSD, but this is the day that it really unfolded for me. He wasn't sleeping quite a bit of insomnia. He was very moody, the mood swings, the anger, the hostility. It was all directed towards us at home in the family, more so than anyone else saw. And so when I would mention things to people, I don't think he's doing well, they kind of brushed it off. No, he's fine. We talked to him yesterday. He's fine. We went to the movies to watch this military movie, and he had a full panic attack in the movie theater. Couldn't breathe, thought he was having a heart attack, crying, and I couldn't get him out of the theater. He's 6'6", I'm 5'2". He's about 280 pounds, I'm maybe 120, and I couldn't physically get him out of the theater. People were staring. It was really, it was embarrassing, but it was scary. I finally got him out of the theater, and I remember saying, do you need to go to the hospital? Do you need to go to the hospital? And he said, no, I'm not going to the hospital. And I sat in the car and I said, you're going to have to get help. You can't keep going like this. And at that point, I had been saying, I think you have PTSD. I think you should go to counseling. And he kept saying, no, I'm not going, I'm fine. And that day he said, okay, I'll think about it. What I didn't realize at this point was he had a lot of PTSD from the shooting. But something I had never considered and never thought about was why he originally became a police officer to begin with. Was he came from a family of drug addicts. His parents were both addicts. They were very abusive, neglectful of him growing up. And his way of making the world right and helping other people was to become a police officer. And it was for the right reasons. That's honorable. But he never healed from that trauma. So he carried that trauma with him into the military, where he had more trauma added to it, and then became law enforcement, where more trauma was added to the trauma that he never dealt with growing up. So his actual trauma, his family of origin, came from his parents. And that unresolved trauma, when compounded with being shot in the line of duty, just boiled the pot over to full-blown PTSD. And by that point, things had gotten so bad. I remember going to work and making lists of all these counseling centers, all these organizations, and I would call them every day. I need help. And the answer was always the same. There's no help for law enforcement. Going the veteran side, there was help, but he wasn't injured while serving, so that was kind of tricky to work around, and we just weren't getting anywhere. We weren't getting any help. I finally asked him to go to the VA. I actually didn't give him much of a choice, and he said that he would go to the VA. By that time, the PTSD symptoms, he had almost all of them. Anger, fear, survivor's guilt, insomnia, ulcers. He had been in the hospital twice with bleeding ulcers, which I did not know could be a symptom of PTSD. Hypervigilance. He was never relaxed, never calm. He had stopped going anywhere. Our kids are in sports. He had stopped going to soccer games. He had stopped going to church. He had stopped going shopping, out to eat with us. He would just ask us to bring him something back. It was like, for me, being married to someone that I didn't even know anymore. I didn't recognize that person at all. There were some issues at work. They had called a few times with some issues, and I remember thinking that's so unlike him. I didn't really know what was happening. I started reading everything I could about PTSD, trying to help him, thinking I could help. But at one point I remember thinking, there's all these signs, there's all these symptoms of PTSD, and everyone pretty much will just put a PTSD label on anything. But he had become volatile, and there was a lot of violence happening in our home. I had physically pulled him off of our children numerous times, And everywhere I read associated with PTSD said, violence, but that's not a sign of PTSD. When you've hit that point, you're way beyond PTSD. And without help, it's going to get worse. And I can remember thinking, what's going to come next? I didn't even know what to expect. When we called the VA, I remember thinking, this is it. This is our answer. We're going to get help. I was completely disheartened with the system because what I learned was it was about 6 months before he ever even saw an actual person at the VA. He had a 2-month wait for an intake, and then after that they sent him to a doctor, which was another month-long wait. And then after that they set up an appointment 2 months later with a therapist. So for about 6 months, he was just getting worse and worse and worse. Finally, he gets into the therapist at the VA, and he comes home with a brown paper bag full of pills. That was their answer. And I'm sure there was no way for them to know, although they should have, that he's the product of 2 drug addicts. And they just handed him a bag full of medication. So they gave him antidepressants, Cymbalta for the depression, Xanax for the panic attacks, Seroquel because he wasn't sleeping. He was off work at that point in those 6 months. He had gone to the doctor because his back was hurting, and what we found was he was limping from being shot, which had curved his spine and popped his discs out. So the doctor had put him on oxys and Percocets as well. So he was on about 6 medications, all highly addictive, and of course he became addicted, which I was completely unaware of at the time. Looking back, I can see it really clearly, but at the time I never thought. I remember thinking probably should keep an eye on that because his parents are addicts and the risk is there, but he's a police officer, he knows what he's doing. I really didn't watch it maybe as well as I should have. His anger progressed on the medications. I don't know if it was a side effect to the medications or just the fact that he was misusing them and had completely just fallen apart. At that point, I was still trying to get help. He was supposed to be going to therapy. I was at work one day and I got a call from the therapist's office. And they said, is everything okay? He hasn't been to therapy in about a month. And I called him and I said, how's therapy going? And he said, good, I went this morning. And at that point, I knew he was lying, and I knew things were a lot worse than I even knew. I can remember at that point in time when he was heavily medicated and so unpredictable, the kids, we would come home from work and school, and we would all go hide in our bedrooms because it was anything and everything he would flip out about. And we would be eating dinner and noises would set him off. We were eating dinner one night, and our oldest child has high functioning autism. He was 15 at the time, and his table manners are kind of shady. So he was eating kind of loudly, and he picked our son's dinner plate up and slammed it into the wall and shattered the plate against the wall. And I didn't know what to do. I called actually his friends at the department 3 different times, and I said, he's going to hurt one of these kids. And they would come to the house and they would talk to him and they would leave. There was never any report filed. There was never any, we need to do something, he's out of control. It was just, I think they felt bad because he was shot, and they knew that it could have been any one of them, and they didn't want him to get in trouble, so they didn't do anything. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when they walked out that door, because they felt their own guilt, because he risked his life for them, they left us in an unsafe situation, and myself or my children could have been killed at any point in time during that, and almost were at the end. I can remember calling for help one of the kids we have 3 boys and a girl, and one of the kids had peed on the toilet seat. And he had flipped out and drug him into the bathroom where he was beating him in the floor, which is just the craziest thing. And I pulled him off of him, and I called the non-emergency number for dispatch, and I said, I need you to send me an officer, and they did. And the officer talked to him and then left. And I can remember when he left thinking, we're gonna die in this situation because no one sees it. No one's acknowledging it. And the advice that I would get from them is, he looks really bad. You should probably make sure he's going to therapy. Are you making sure he takes his medication? You need to get him out of the house. And all of that was placed on me as the spouse. There was never any accountability to him. And that's wrong. That's wrong. And I took that very personally. And I felt like I was failing him as a wife because I couldn't get him out of the house, and I couldn't get him to take his medications. I couldn't get any of those things done. So I felt personally responsible in a lot of ways. I think that they just didn't know what to do. Just before he was put off work, I can remember getting a phone call at work from a woman. And she said, your husband assaulted my son, which is so out of character for him. In all of his law enforcement career, he had a stellar career, not even a blemish. And here this woman is calling me saying that he had assaulted her son. But at the time, he was assaulting us at home. And so in my mind, I'm thinking this could potentially be true. And I called the sheriff, and the deputy sheriff says, oh, I'm not even worried about it. She said that he was cussing and he punched her son in the face, but I know that he would never cuss, and I know that he would never punch anyone in the face. We're not even worried about it. But what they didn't know was that was going on at home behind closed doors almost daily at that point. And so I can remember thinking, this is really bad. He's gonna kill someone either at home or at work, and no one's listening to me. One of the troopers, who is a good friend of ours, had said that they had a big blow up at the department, and it was so out of character because they had been friends for 12 years and had always gotten along and worked together on many cases. They were working a case together, and the trooper said that he blew up on him and threatened to punch him in the face, and 3 other officers had to get between them. And I think back and I think, how did they not see this? How did they not acknowledge that this was happening? And they all swept it under the rug under the guise of, well, he was shot, he has PTSD. And I'm at home doing the same, saying, well, he was shot, he has PTSD. But at the end of the day, that's not an excuse for any of those behaviors. And had there been an intervention then, it would have stopped then and not led into what happened at the end. I was at work and I got a call from him, and he said, Vanessa, I'm done. And I thought, well, what are you done with? And he said, life. I'm done with life. So I leave work. He had called my cell phone, thankfully. I grabbed my keys and I walked out, and I drove home where he was sitting with the gun. And I just remember thinking, my kids were at school. I've got to talk him down. And I did. I said, what do you need me to do? He said, I don't know. And I said, well, let's go see your therapist, because you and I both know you haven't been going to therapy. Let's go see the therapist. And he finally agreed, and so we get the gun put away, get in the car, we're driving to the therapist, and I'm driving down there thinking they're going to put him somewhere and get him some help. And at that point, he was in full-blown addiction that I was unaware of. He was also drinking every day. He was put off work because of his back. He was supposed to be picking the kids up from school, and I was getting calls every day from the school. Your kids are still here. Your husband forgot to pick the kids up. I was calling the department saying, I'm afraid he's going to kill himself. I think you guys should take the guns. Can you come check on him? And they would. They came and took him to lunch, but they didn't try to help in any other way. So I'm driving him to the therapist, and I'm thinking, this is it. We're going to get some help. And we go down there, and the therapist says, are you taking your medication? He was taking 6 and 7 pills at a time. I didn't know, but he tells the therapist he's not taking any of them. And the therapist says, go home and take your medication for 30 days and then come back and see me. And ultimately, the responsibility was put back on me to go home and watch him. So again, I felt alone and isolated. That was the longest drive home. I can remember driving home thinking, so far I've not been able to get him to take his medication, and the therapist wants me to watch him for suicide watch. None of that should have ever been placed on me. It wasn't even a week later, maybe 3 or 4 days. I'd called in sick to work the 3 days following because I was afraid that if I would go to work, I would come home and find him dead. I did have someone to come get the guns out of the house, or so I thought. Being law enforcement, of course, he had guns hidden that I didn't know about. And I woke up one Sunday morning for church, and at this point, he wasn't really going to church. I came down the stairs, and he was sitting in the living room on the couch, staring at the TV, and the TV wasn't on. And I remember thinking, this is really bad. And I stood there for several minutes on the stairs, and I was afraid to come down, but I didn't know what to do. I snapped a picture of him, actually. It was the picture from earlier, and I sent it to a friend of mine whose husband was also shot in the line of duty, who suffers with PTSD. And I didn't know PTSD really, so I'm thinking, okay, PTSD, send it to them, and immediately they knew that is not PTSD. We had come out of the PTSD realm many months before, and I just didn't know. We were in full-blown addiction and rage and had completely blown past PTSD 6 months to a year before. So my friend, seeing that picture, immediately began to come towards the house, thankfully. She lived about 45 minutes to an hour away, though. I went down and I sat on the couch beside him, and I tried to talk to him, but he didn't answer. And I waved my hand in front of his face. No response. And I snapped my fingers, and he looked at me, and I said, are you okay? And he said, no, Vanessa, I'm not okay. And at that point, I saw the gun he had kind of tucked under his leg there. And I remember thinking, he's going to shoot himself right here in front of me. The kids are upstairs. We're getting ready for church. The kids were running up and down the stairs, and I said, go get ready for church. And I was completely panicked, but I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. And I said, why don't I call the guys and see if, maybe they could come help. In the past, when he had gotten really bad, I would call and have the guys come take him to lunch or stop by. And ultimately, it backfired on me. I can remember one day he was suicidal, and I called and said, why don't you guys come by and check on him? And when they show up, he says, oh, I'm fine, I'm great. And when they would leave, he would go right back into that depression. They call it the Jekyll-Hyde PTSD. You see it at home, but no one else sees it. So I said, why don't I call the guys? And I'm thinking, they're going to see it this time. There's no hiding it. And he said to me, if you pick up that phone, I'll put a bullet between your effing eyes. And I knew not to pick the phone up. So I just sat there, and we sat in silence. I don't know how long. It felt like forever. My body was just shaking. And at one point I said, I'm going to go to the bathroom. And he didn't answer me, so I kind of slowly got up. I had my phone, and I started walking towards the bathroom, and he didn't move, so I thought, okay, I've got this. And I went in the bathroom, and I texted my friend Sam that I had sent the picture to, and she said, we're on our way. And I said, okay. So I went back out, and I sat back down beside him, and he looked over at me, and his eyes were black, and he said, if one car pulls in that driveway, I'm gonna effing shoot you right in the head. And I said, okay. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna get out of that room before they pulled in. Fortunately, we have a dog, a very loud dog, and 4 kids. So they were being kind of rambunctious, and he didn't hear the car pull in the driveway. So Sam and Stephen were able to talk him down and get the gun. And they made a call to a friend of ours, Melissa Littles, who runs the Police Wife Life, who called Safe Call Now. I didn't even know about Safe Call Now at the time. And within an hour, my phone rang, and it was Safe Call Now, and they said, we're going to get you some help. And I just remember feeling like I could breathe again. For so long, I felt like I couldn't breathe, and I felt like I could breathe. And I put him on the phone, and they said, we're going to get you out of here. We're going to get you some help. And he didn't want to go, but they didn't really take no for an answer. Within, I don't know, maybe 6 hours, everything was set up for him to go to treatment to get help. Plane tickets were bought, the facility where he was going, everything was done. And I just remember thinking, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. This is what I've been praying for. We're going to be okay. I took him and put him on the plane, and I just thought, okay, we thought we had been through the worst when he was shot. We had no idea how bad it was going to get, but we made it through that. Now he's going to treatment. It's going to be okay. He went to treatment, and I fell apart. I did not realize that there was such a thing as secondary PTSD or caregiver PTSD. The day after he left, I couldn't function. I could not function. My life had revolved around him and his PTSD and his rage and his violence for so long. I remember going in the grocery store after he left to get food. I hadn't been to the grocery store because I was watching him, making sure he didn't kill himself. Went in the grocery store, and I fell to pieces. I couldn't even buy groceries. I left the grocery store with nothing, and I thought, what is wrong with me? What's happening to me? I had a panic attack in the grocery store. I'd never had a panic attack. I called my doctor, and I went in and I said, is it possible to catch PTSD because he's not even here? And now I'm behaving in the way he was behaving, and they said it's secondary PTSD. I had to get help for myself, but that's when I really started seeing the toll that it took on my kids. They were so angry, and they had picked up a lot of his volatile behaviors, throwing things across the room. They were violent with each other. It was months of therapy, and, we would sit at the table, and I would tell them, your dad had problems, but those are unacceptable behaviors, and we're not going to allow that in our home anymore. At one point, he had been in treatment a few months when I got the phone call that he didn't want to continue treatment. He was in a very good facility, had one of the best therapists in the world, and he just didn't want to participate in it. I can remember the therapist telling me, you have some choices to make. You're going to have to protect you and your children. And that was probably the hardest decision of my life. I felt like I was taking their dad away from them if I didn't allow him to come back. But seeing what he had done to them was a big eye-opener for me. And about 8 months after he left, I had gone to the facility he was at and discovered that he was telling me he was doing great. His therapists were telling me he was not. When I went out to the facility, I did learn he was not doing well. Not only was he continuing his fits of rage there and storming out of therapy, not going to therapy, he had picked up several women on the side in rehab. And I just remember thinking, I can't live like this anymore, and neither can the children. Someone said to me there, Vanessa, you don't have to stay as sick as he chooses to stay. And I thought, okay, I'm not. I'm going to work on healing myself and healing these kids. And so I filed for divorce, and he walked out of the treatment center. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I came back from the facility, and once I filed those papers, the sheriff department decided not to have anything else to do with our family. They had put all the responsibility of his treatment and his healing on me. And when I decided I could no longer live with it, they dropped us like we never existed. I received some pretty nasty messages from other wives. I was ridiculed a lot. I went to church one night, and I was pulled in the office, and I was asked if I filed for divorce, and I said yes. And I was told that that's a sin, which it is what it is. I was told that I could no longer do ministry at the church because I was filing for divorce, that it was wrong. I tried to tell them about the abuse. They didn't believe it at all because he was this wonderful man with this stellar career, and how could he be an abuser? I was basically called a liar to my face. I tried to tell them what he was doing in rehab, and I was told that I should have forgiveness. And I chose not to do that. I forgave him, but I chose not to live in it anymore. And so I remember leaving the church and thinking, I was back to that 12-year-old little girl sitting there in the church that failed to protect me. And I was so angry. And I thought, where is God in any of this? I don't see it. But I went home, and I hit depression pretty bad, about 3 months. And I started to see God working. And God spoke right to me, though, and he said, Vanessa, people are going to fail you, but I will not. And I thought, okay. And I picked myself up, and the kids and I started visiting other churches, and God is still good. He's not good based on my circumstance. He's good based on what he does, not on what I do or not on what other people do to me. So I found peace with that. But what I discovered was there's no help for the family of the first responder. And I can remember when we were going through all of that, no one ever said, Vanessa, how are you? How are the kids? It was, how's he doing? How's he doing? How's he? And I mean, how are you? How's your family? What do you need? Instead, it was, how dare you not help him? How dare you not check his medications? Why are you letting him stay home all the time? How dare you divorce him? There was never any compassion for the family and what we went through. Ultimately, I ended up contacting Safe Call Now, who had put him into treatment, and asking them to come and speak at a conference because I felt like we couldn't be the only family going through this. At that conference, several people that I work with in the first responder world sat with me and said, there's such a huge need for help for people like you and for first responders, because had we gotten the help initially in the beginning when things started to go bad, my family wouldn't have fallen apart the way it did. And so we put together a team, a really amazing team called Armor Up West Virginia, and that's how we came to be. We connected with Safe Call Now, who puts the first responders into treatment. And through that, I found so much healing in helping other people. in helping other families not go through what my family has gone through, we put several first responders in treatment last month, and we had a meeting in my hometown 2 weeks ago, and several of those families showed up. And it was so amazing to see that their family didn't suffer what my family did, because they picked up the phone and they made a phone call and they got help that day. It didn't have to come to the point where it was so far gone off track and so far down the road that there was no help. We were able to help these families heal and put their families back together. And for me, that's all that matters, because holding my children at night and answering those questions of, why doesn't Daddy love me anymore? Why doesn't Daddy want to get better? I don't think that any mother should have to do that. And not only did I have to do that, I had to do that alone. I didn't have the support of the department. I didn't have the support of the church. I didn't have that. So what we do is we step in and we give that support to the family. When I send a first responder out, the first thing I do is call the wife and say, how are you? Tell me your story. What are you going through? What do you need? Because that's not what they get. And that's been the most rewarding thing I think that I've done in my life. So I have found purpose in what I'm doing, and I really enjoy it. And I enjoy working with Armor Up. I enjoy working with Safe Call Now. If I could say anything to those who work in administration, the chiefs, the sheriffs, all those out there who are the head of the department, I would tell them, talk to the family. If something seems off, he was definitely having issues at work, but no one took it seriously. It was always, he would never do that. He's got a stellar career. Oh, he doesn't cuss. He wouldn't cuss that person. When those complaints started coming in, they were ignored. When I was calling and saying he's abusing the kids, it was, he would never do that. He's a good man. He's a deacon in the church. He would never do that. No one took it seriously. And I think had the sheriff shown up at my door and said, what's going on, and spoken to me and spoken to my children, he would have gotten a completely different story than when he spoke to my husband at the time and said, what's going on? And he got, oh no, I'm fine. Yeah, I have a little PTSD, but I'm going to counseling. Had he come to me, I would have said he's not going to counseling. He's not showing up for those things. He is abusive in the home. And we could have stopped it right there and sent him out for help. But that didn't happen. There were so many missed opportunities to intervene. So my advice is, talk to the families. And when something like this happens, don't forget that family. Don't forget to go check on that family, because, they say, thin blue line, we've got your back, we're all a family. And initially, that was true. When he was shot, hundreds of officers were there. We had food for days, for weeks, phone calls. But when PTSD came, you could hear crickets. No one checked on us. No one came by. No one brought food. When he went to treatment, I was the one making the phone calls. They didn't call me. They didn't stop by to check on me. It was me calling them. And I think that's a shame. I think that's where we're missing it. If we're going to say we're this big thin blue line and we're going to say we're a family, then we need to be a family, and that includes PTSD. My advice to anyone out there suffering, any first responder at all, first responder, military, and please keep in mind that the family as well can call this number, is call Safe Call Now, 206-459-3020. It's a first responder crisis hotline, first responder to first responder. When you call that phone number, another first responder is going to answer. It's completely confidential. Safe Call Now saved my family's life in more ways than one. And even though my ex-husband chose not to take the treatment, ultimately Safe Call Now ended up saving my family, because had we continued on the road that we were going down, I probably would have ended up dead, and possibly even my children. But because Safe Call Now intervened, we're here, we're happy, we're healthy, we're doing great. So don't hesitate to make that call.
Force to Focus Studios. Captivate and inspire your audience with breathtaking images,